Welcome. Oh man, the production quality does not get better. What the hell is this? What do we got? What do we got? I mean, whatever, whatever. Tonight I've been playing with some ideas. I'm writing them down. This time, a Substack article is definitely getting out of drafts, and it's probably going to end up being a couple of different things. A little sip of the silly juice, but I wanted to review a video real quick with you guys. The concept of animal domestication. It seems to drive people for a little bit of a silly little loop. And it's interesting to see people's reactions. You go to places like the Creation Museum, and you know, you go through Ken Ham. He's got this. I guess the Ark experience is different than the Creation Museum, but whatever. He's got the Creation Museum and the Ark experience. They're like within a couple minutes of each other. But you go through and you see this giant monolithic project. It's all hand carved wood. Like they built the whole Ark, or at least as close to the biblical Ark as you could get. And then the interior is like an entire museum dedicated to explaining to you how it could have worked, based on the biblical description of the flood, which I happen to fully take on faith with that. They start with the idea of the kinds as their kind of taxonomical starting point, right? And so the idea is like, well, they didn't need zebras and horses and all manner of creatures. You needed one like kind of archetypical representative, like a biological archetype of all horse kind. You don't need wolves and all the dogs that exist as species. You just need two archetypical canid kinds and lupine kinds for foxes, and so you start with this idea that once the Ark landed on Mount Ararat, the animals left the Ark, immediately start reproducing and scattering, and let's take alpacas for example. Alpacas are part of the camelid kind, right? They're in the same family as dromedaries and three-toed camels or whatever, llamas, alpacas. They're all camelids, meaning they stem from one camel kind. They bred and traveled all across multiple continents and spread out. And through the genetic isolation and the environmental pressures and founder selection, you end up with disparate types of creatures that are similar in appearance, but ultimately very different. Like a dromedary is probably 4 times the size of a camel or an alpaca. And some cases you can still interbreed these creatures. In many cases you can't, but they all stem from one or I guess 2 sets of ultimate parents within this kind of taxonomy. And I'm going to save the rest for later. But within there's an argument of time dilation, right? Like, well, you can't have that much speciation on the planet within whatever 10 to 12,000 years since the Noatic flood. And okay, what if I told you could have significant genetic shift if with like specific selection pressures? Now, this experiment that we're going to talk about the Soviets and the West both had this interesting encounter with the idea of races and nations, and it was they repudiate the mean mustache man and nationalism, but from opposite sides of the coin. So the Russians, the Soviets, like famously rejected Darwinianism because as it applied to humans, because it would give rise to a theory of naturally developing classes, and that obviously is no bueno if you're trying to have a classless society. From the West, it extended the reach of the liberal tenets of tabula rasa, where everyone is a blank slate and you are a product of your environment, and maybe genetics has like a little bit of an effect on it, but it's mostly just the life that the fates have for you mixed with your individual decisions, and that is the totality of man. And I think both are probably flawed. But going back to the foxes, you have this time dilation requirement where it's like, well, how does this happen? Well, a Russian biologist who was previously fired from his state-appointed post as a head of some sort of fur breeding bureaucracy, because I guess that was still a fairly sizable economy during Soviet Russia in the 50s. He was fired from this job as like a directorship position because he held to, I guess, orthodox Darwinian views of genetics, which is a big no-no. So he gets fired. He ends up going out to Siberia and establishing effectively a college for genetic research. And he kind of hid it under, well, he hid the fact that he's really researching genetics by the fact that he's just like, we're trying to breed the best fur producing foxes ever. So this experiment started in Soviet Russia, and it effectively continues to this day. So we're gonna check out this video, and let me make sure I have. Yeah, there it is. Okay, let's watch the video together, and I'll stop for fair use and whatever, and have some commentary.
I really think that the Belyaev experiments was one of the most significant experiments in evolution that took place in the 20th century. And it affected my life and my thinking in so many ways.
The experiment was begun in the 1950s at a fox farm in Siberia. The foxes were being bred for their fur, but they were wild animals that were hard to handle and often too stressed to breed. Dmitry Belyaev, a geneticist, was taken on to see if he could develop foxes that would be easier to keep. He began his experiment by breeding together those foxes with the least excitable temperaments.
So in his research, he's specifically selecting for temperament. He's ignoring all other factors. So, the purpose, the stated purpose of this experiment was to develop, the best fur possible, or the most efficient harvest of fur possible from these animals. And I don't think the Soviets particularly cared about the mental state of the animals, so long as they were getting efficient fur, right? I don't think there was a whole lot of animal rights activism happening in the 1950s Soviet Russia. But so under the guise of like fur efficiency, he's coming in with a specific idea to see how nature versus nurture works. He's trying to unmask this. So he is selecting them specifically for temperament. And in the research paper, he goes specifically into detail about what that ultimately means. But I want you to keep in mind, he's not selecting for any physical traits, just temperament. And, however they're quantifying that with how they interact with humans.
Belyaev selected foxes by a simple method. He extended a gloved hand into each animal's cage. The foxes that attacked, cowered, or bit him were excluded from breeding. But those that showed tolerance or curiosity were mated together. In effect, Belyaev was selecting the foxes for their flight distance. The subsequent results were staggering. The new generations of foxes were transformed not just in behavior, but in their appearance.
That's interesting, right? Why would behaviors have a physiological manifestation? You know, Darwin famously said the only animal with droopy ear, the only non-domesticated animal in the entire wild with droopy ears was the elephant. And the elephant is a special case, you know, whether or not God gave them those big ears as heat mitigation, you know, big fans and you know, heat exchangers to cool them down, or whether or not they were some sort of like, you know, antediluvian society, you know, domesticated the elephant first because they were useful in carrying giant monolithic stones up the courseways to the Tower of Babel. Who knows? I'm not going to speculate on that kind of nonsense. But it is interesting that even naturalists, which are the ones, there's one that means like people who are nude in inappropriate places, and the other means people who study nature. And I get them confused quite frequently. But the ones that study nature often identify domestic animals have specific physiological traits that goes as deep as the melanin in their fur and in their skin. Oftentimes, domesticated animals are what they call piebald, which means they have some tendency towards a non-uniform loss of melanin in their coats. They often domesticated animals often have different types of hair and fur. With sheep, you know, the fur gets wavy and curly. With dogs, the fur gets less coarse, and it can generate into different lengths. And these are all physiological differences that are manifesting not for selecting the creature to breed based on any of those physiological traits, right? Like if I'm breeding alpacas, I want alpacas that produce the best quality fiber. So that's length, and I think it's called knit, but it's like how tightly curled the alpaca fibers are versus their overall length. These are all attractive traits in prize alpacas because you're breeding alpacas specifically for the quality of the fiber that they can produce, so that, you know, hippies can wear really nice socks on their hike when they're going up Boulder. But the scientists here, Belyaev, is not selecting for physiological traits. He's just selecting for temperament.
Within just 10 years, the selected foxes showed new variety in their color. Some were born with mottled coats or black and white patches.
That's an example of what they call like piebalding. If you're a deer hunter, I know what you're thinking, like, oh, you see a piebald deer. It's like, it's quasi-albino, right? A little bit of, it's a yes and type of situation, but this is a type of piebalding.
Their ears became floppy. They started to bark, vocalize. They became highly playful even into adulthood, and were no longer afraid of people.
So it's manifesting in behavioral changes and cultural changes, right? You have a species that communicates through, like, I don't know if you've ever listened to foxes in the wild. We have a boatload of foxes where I live. So much so that, like, keeping chickens alive is a chore unto itself. And one night we had a fox. My property, you know, I'm not on public sewer. I'm out in the sticks. So there's a septic tank right outside my master bedroom that you know, one of the access ports to the tank is right outside my master bedroom window. We're on the first floor. And one night, my wife and I awoke to the craziest sounding shrieking right outside of our window. It sounded like a woman was being like murdered right outside of my window. And so it was a Johnny get your gun type of situation. We got the flashlight, checked it out. It was a damn fox sitting on the little you know, access tube, the concrete lid on my septic tank, screaming at the woods behind my house from the top of my septic tank. And that's what foxes do in the wild. So they're changing their vocalizations, they're changing their entire culture, the way they present themselves, not just to humans, but to each other.
Some of the foxes even began to answer to their names. Belyaev had stumbled across the discovery that selecting for the quality of tameness alone could set off a cascade of other changes. We can still see evidence of this quantum leap at the same research center today.
Up to that point, we all kind of believed Darwin. And Darwin said, nature does not go in leaps. Things don't happen fast. They happen gradually. And the answer was, with Belyaev's experiment, he was wrong. They do go in leaps, and sometimes big leaps, things that you wouldn't expect.
So there's the time truncation, right? If you're looking at, like, assuming speciation happens at a, like, crazy slow level, right? And if we're talking about, like, the primordial soup hypothesis, where, like, all life sprang forth out of some sort of primordial soup and proteins began to formulate, and there was some sort of evolutionary advantage to those proteins congregating into, like, some sort of, like, mitochondria, like simple organism, and those organisms continue to get more and more complex based on evolutionary pressures, and those organisms began to form more complex organisms all the way down the line to the point where, you know, you're having some sort of, like, a hairless lizard creature crawl out of the sea, and somehow developing you know, mutations that are heritable through sexual reproduction. Like, those types of changes are what Darwin was grappling with, and, you know, that's where we even the 14 billion year number is way too short of a time period for that. But if we're talking about there's founding selection, meaning we have two sets of animal kind that come off the ark, and that environmental and sexual selective pressures are able to speciate with you know, a little bit of genetic isolation, and manifest in not just temperamental but also physiological changes very quickly. It kind of lends credence to a number of different things that I'm talking about.
The theory is that we're dealing with some underlying structure. When we're dealing with tameness, we're dealing with a set of genetics that is producing a characteristic response.
It is not a coincidence that many domesticated animals are black and white. When selection is made for tameness, it impacts on the entire makeup of the animal.
Isn't that interesting that behavior would cluster with physiological traits? It's just, I'm not making any assertions here. I'm just saying it is interesting that you can observe in nature that when you domesticate an animal and select for behavioral traits, they manifest in physiological formation. It's just interesting.
Scientists have determined that adrenaline, the fight or flight hormone, and melanin, the skin and fur pigment, are chemically connected.
Fight or flight hormone. Is that like that the warrior gene? No, it's not like that. I'm not.
So they change together, as are the neurotransmitters dopamine and noradrenaline, which control behaviors. Affect one system, and there is a domino effect, from color to behaviors. Coppinger's scavenging wolves may have undergone a similar transformation.
When all of a sudden Belyaev did his experiments, it changed the way a lot of us began to think about dogs. People talked about, why did people select dogs to have this coat color or that coat color and so on? Why did people select dogs to bark? And then all of a sudden we realized that those were a bunch of really silly questions, because we could get all of that just by selecting for tameness.
Belyaev had created foxes that looked and behaved like dogs. His experiment suggested that the transformation of the wild wolf into the dog could have happened in the blink of an evolutionary eye. The stage was set for the development of the dog into the incredible variety we have today.
So, this is something I've been thinking about, and it's not good. Look, you have creatures, and what the research indicated was that you can effectively domesticate and create an entirely new strain of animal within 14 generations. And there wasn't. It's not just temperament. It's not just like aesthetic traits, the physiological traits. It is total morphological selection within their genome. So their ears, how their ears behave. The foxes went from having pointy predatory ears to floppy ears, like big floppy ears. Their snouts became shorter. Their bites became weaker. Their fecundity went up. So if you have a domesticated animal, or wild animals normally breed, once a year, and it's largely dependent upon temperature and sunlight. And so, with the deer, you have a rut once a year, usually in late fall. With other animals, you have some sort of breeding season where a gestation period is over winter. Like with most mammals, you have like bears, they breed in the fall. They gestate over the winter, and then they give birth in their dens right before they emerge from hibernation. With foxes, it's very similar. You have a overwinter gestation and a spring birthing. Very common with most mammals. Bunnies are a little bit different, but prey animals and predators are often different. But with the domestic foxes, they were able to breed. Vixens were able to have 2 litters a year. So you have a compounding phenomenon where you're able to squeeze in more generations that are specifically selected for these traits. And yeah, one of the other aspects of the research is that if you allow it to go uncontrolled, if you allow them back in gen pop and bring in non-tame foxes back into the mix, you effectively erase generations of work that was happening here. And it's fascinating to me how many times very scientific research was done to try to prove the hypothesis. This is an approach from the opposite end. This is a guy who believed that behavior and temperament and domestication were all genetic traits, and that you can display this through empiric research. There was a lot of scientists in America, especially in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that approached it from the other angle. Like, we're going to raise a toddler with a chimp and prove that, we can make a chimp just as smart as a toddler by raising it as a human. And it turned out the toddler grew up with severe issues. And I think I'd have to look it up again, but I think the toddler the kid grew up and ultimately ended his own life. There was another one, Black Pill did a stream on it recently, but it was about these hippie guys from Colombia raised this chimp from a baby in a monkey mansion and tried to raise it to be just like any other kid. And turned out, like, as soon as it hit adulthood, it was a wild animal and started like ripping people's faces and stuff. And whether we like it or not, there is ample evidence that behavior, appearance, these are things that are intrinsically linked to your genes, to your breeding. And I would argue that the Western civilization was built on 1,000 years or more, probably closer to like 1,700 years. And if the Roman accounts of the pagans are to be believed, probably a lot longer than that. Thousands of years of extremely prejudicial capital punishment for slight offenses, stealing horses, stealing food, And so the application of capital punishment is effectively a top-down enforcement of breeding selection. And so you have people that are governed by a increasingly Christianized moral law in which the smallest infractions against that law are treated with death, or at a minimum treated with a punishment that would make it difficult for you to be viewed as a good match in a sexual pair bonding. And through all of these generations upon generation, you end up with the compounding effect of people who are lawful, who are who people who pass the marshmallow test. And I think a lot of that behavior is genetic, and I think it does tie in a lot of ways to appearance and the way we speak to each other, the cultures that develop. These are things that don't just happen in some sort of liberalized vacuum. So what do we do with that? Well, for now, I'm interested in seeing if this project holds water for bears. Because if within 14 generations, if we can domesticate the bear, if we could have, Ursine domesticus, I think that would sell gangbusters. Perhaps we could start small. We could buy a little, I don't know, maybe Josh Apatow will throw me a couple $1 million, but we can have a little bit of the Ridge Runner land. Give me a little corner of that land in Tennessee. We're going to domesticate raccoons first. The case study will be raccoons. Everyone loves their trash panda, Rocket the raccoon. It's big in Japan right now too. So what we could do is we get all these little tanukis, these little raccoons, and we're going to breed them for temperament. We're going to do it for 14 generations, and then we're going to come out with, the domesticated raccoon, and people will go gangbusters for them. And then we're going to graduate into bears. So that is the domesticated foxes, the Russian foxes, the weird Russian foxes. I don't think this is an isolated thing where people were finding that genes are clustered. For behavioral genes are clustered, that they control more than what we give them credit for. I think we've kind of lost touch with the idea that noble breeding is good, that there are entailments to who we select to be our mate that affect our children, and not just our children, but our society as a whole, and that a good paterfamilias would take into consideration all available data before making his daughter available to the masses. But that's just me. This has been PackerCast. Have a good one.